When did ancient humans start drinking alcohol? Let's just start with a question that sounds like a joke but isn't. When did humans start drinking? And I don't mean water, I mean the good stuff. The juice that's been left out a little too long. The thing that makes you feel warm, a little wobbly, and suddenly very interested in telling stories. The easy answer is a long time ago. The interesting answer is probably before we were even human. That sounds like a riddle, so let me explain. We have to stop thinking about drinking alcohol as a cultural invention like pottery or the wheel. It's not an invention. It's a discovery. And it's a discovery that every fruit-eating animal on this planet has made, usually by accident, and usually with hilarious or disastrous results. Think about a forest floor in late summer. The air is thick and wet. A fig tree has dropped its load. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of purple-brown figs are splattered on the ground. They've been sitting in the sun for 2 or 3 days. Yeasts, those microscopic fungi that live on the skin of every single fruit, have been having a party. They've been eating the sugars inside those figs. And when yeast eats sugar, it doesn't just get energy. It burps out carbon dioxide and it pees out ethanol. That's alcohol. Now, a monkey swings by. A chimp, maybe, or one of our distant primate cousins. The monkey smells those figs. That ethanol smell, that sharp, sweet, slightly chemical odor. It doesn't repel the monkey. It attracts it. Because that smell means one thing. Sugar is present and it's been broken down. It's easy calories, so the monkey eats the fermented figs. And because these figs have alcohol content of maybe 2 or 3%, like a very weak beer, the monkey gets a little buzz. It moves a little slower. It might be a little friendlier. Or it might start screaming at a leaf. The point is, the connection between ripe, fermented fruit and a physiological state change is ancient. It's written into the deepest parts of our nervous system. For a long time, scientists thought that our ability to process alcohol was a recent thing, tied to agriculture. You know the story. Humans stopped hunting and gathering, started farming grain about 12,000 years ago, accidentally made bread and beer, and boom, civilization. That story is neat. It's tidy. But it's probably wrong. The real story starts about 10 million years ago, give or take a few million. And it starts not in a village, but in the trees. We need to talk about a gene. I know, genes sound boring, but this one is fun. It's called ADH4. That stands for alcohol dehydrogenase 4. In English, it's an enzyme, a little biological machine that lives in your stomach and your liver. Its job is to grab ethanol molecules and start breaking them down into stuff your body can use or get rid of. Basically, ADH4 is your first line of defense against a hangover. Now, here's the kicker. Most mammals have an ADH4 enzyme that is terrible at processing alcohol. I mean, really bad. A cow, for example, has ADH4 that is about 40 times slower than a human's. If a cow eats a bunch of fermented apples, it gets drunk really fast and stays drunk for a long time, because its liver is just waving a white flag at the ethanol. The same goes for horses, dogs, and rats. They have the equipment, but it's low-grade equipment. But around 10 million years ago, something happened to our ancestors. We don't have a fossil of it, but we can see the ghost of it in our DNA. Sometime between when we split off from the ancestors of modern gorillas and when we split off from the ancestors of modern chimpanzees, a single mutation occurred in the ADH4 gene. One tiny typo in the genetic code, and that typo made our version of the ADH4 enzyme between 40 and 400 times more efficient at breaking down ethanol. Let me say that again. 10 million years ago, a monkey-like creature living in the forests of Africa suddenly gained the ability to process alcohol 400 times faster than its cousins. Why? What was the pressure? The leading theory is called the drunken monkey hypothesis, proposed by biologist Robert Dudley. He argues that the ability to digest alcohol gave our ancestors a huge survival advantage. Here's why. The forest floor is not a grocery store. It's a battlefield. The best food, the ripest, sweetest, most calorie-dense fruit, doesn't fall from the tree and wait politely. It falls, ferments within hours, and then everything wants it. But here's the catch. Alcohol is a signal. That ethanol smell doesn't just attract primates. It attracts insects, bacteria, and molds. A fermented fruit is a race against rot. The yeast produces alcohol to kill off bacteria. It's a natural preservative. And so, a fruit that has fermented is actually safer to eat than a fruit that is just rotting. The alcohol has killed the bad bugs. But there's a problem. If you eat a fermented fruit with a low-efficiency ADH4 enzyme, you get drunk. Your coordination fails. You can't climb trees as well. You stumble. In a forest full of leopards and snakes, a stumbling primate is a dead primate. So, most animals avoid fermented fruit. They eat the fresh stuff and run. But our ancestor, the one who got the mutation, didn't get drunk. Or at least, not as fast. That 400 times faster enzyme meant they could eat the fermented fruit on the ground, the fruit that no other primate was eating, because they were too afraid of the booze, and they could extract the calories without losing the ability to climb a tree away from a predator. This was a superpower. While other monkeys were fighting over the last fresh figs in the canopy, our ancestors were scooping up the leftovers on the forest floor, the ones already bubbling with yeast, and getting a calorie-rich meal. They could access a food source that was essentially off-limits to their competitors. So, when did ancient humans start drinking alcohol, according to our genes? 10 million years ago. That's when we started metabolizing it. That's when we started using it as a tool for survival. That is the deep biological anchor. The desire to drink is not a weakness. It is an evolutionary echo of a time when being able to handle your liquor meant you didn't starve. But hold on, there's a difference between eating a fermented fig and brewing a beer. One is foraging, the other is culture. So, when did that leap happen? When did we go from accidental consumption to intentional production? That's a trickier question, because booze doesn't fossilize. A puddle of fermented honey water from 30,000 years ago is just a puddle in the dirt now. We can't dig it up. So, archaeologists have to be clever. They look for the ghosts of alcohol, the tools, the residues, the contexts. Let's walk forward in time. We've got our little furry ancestor with the superliver, scrambling around the Miocene forests. Fast forward, a lot. Now, we're talking about Homo erectus. This is about 1.8 million years ago. Erectus is the first hominin that looks kind of like us. Longer legs, smaller teeth, bigger brain. They're walking out of Africa. They're using stone tools. They might even be using fire. Did Homo erectus drink? Almost certainly, yes. But it was still opportunistic. Imagine an Homo erectus group finding a hollowed-out log that has collected rainwater and a bunch of fallen grapes or berries. The sun warms it, wild yeasts do their work. A week later, they come back and find a pool of 2% alcohol wine. They drink it, they feel good, they remember that place. But there's no evidence yet that they made it happen on purpose. That requires a shift in thinking. It requires the ability to delay gratification and to link a series of abstract steps: collect fruit, crush it, leave it, wait to a future result drunk. That kind of planning is usually associated with Homo sapiens and maybe Neanderthals. So let's jump to the big moment, the one that changes everything, the Upper Paleolithic, about 40,000 years ago. Humans are everywhere. They're painting caves, they're making beads, they're burying their dead. And they have started to accumulate stuff. They're not just living hand-to-mouth anymore. They have stores of food. They have grain-gathering cultures. And where you have stored grain, you have accidents. For millions of years, humans gathered wild barley and wheat. They'd pound the seeds into a flour. But if that flour gets wet, it becomes a porridge. And if that porridge sits out for a day or two, the wild yeasts, the same ones on the fig skins, get into it. The porridge starts to bubble. It gets slightly fizzy. It gets slightly alcoholic. The first beer wasn't brewed. It was a failed porridge that someone was too stubborn to throw away. And when they ate that porridge, they got a little buzz. And then they did something radical. They tried to make the failure happen again on purpose. The problem is, 40,000-year-old porridge doesn't leave a mark. So, for a long time, the earliest hard evidence for intentional alcohol was from about 9,000 years ago in China, a site called Jiahu. You might have heard of it. They found pottery jars with chemical signatures of a mixed fermented drink: rice, honey, and fruit. That was the headline for years. World's oldest alcohol found in China. And that was exciting. But science moves fast, and the definition of intentional gets fuzzy the further back you go. In the last decade or so, we've pushed the date back, way back. And the evidence comes from a place you might not expect, a cave in Israel called Rakafet. And the date? 13,000 years ago, but not just 13,000. The alcohol wasn't for everyday drinking. It was for the dead. The Natufian people were a fascinating group. They lived right at the end of the last ice age. They weren't quite farmers, but they weren't just wandering hunters either. They were sedentary hunter-gatherers. They lived in stone houses. They harvested wild cereals, and they buried their dead in communal graves. At Rakafet Cave, archaeologists found stone mortars carved into the bedrock. These weren't just for grinding flour. When they scraped the insides and analyzed the residue, they found microscopic remains of starch grains. But these starch grains were damaged in a very specific way. They had little pits and cracks that happen only when grain is malted. Malted. Do you know what malting is? It's the first step of beer brewing. You soak a grain in water, let it start to sprout, and then you stop the sprouting by heating it. This process unlocks the sugars inside the grain. It's a deliberate, technical process. It's not an accident. The Natufians, 13,000 years ago, were malting wild barley and wheat. And they were doing it inside a burial cave. The chemical analysis showed traces of oxalate, also known as beerstone, a byproduct of brewing. These people weren't just eating fermented porridge. They were making beer, and they were making it to pour into the graves of their ancestors. This is huge. This is the first clear evidence of alcohol as a ritual substance. Not just calories, not just a buzz, but a connection to the spirit world. A drink for the dead. Think about that. Before we had writing, before we had kings, before we had the wheel, we had beer. And we used it to talk to the people we lost. So, 13,000 years is the current hard archaeological evidence for brewing. But the story doesn't stop there. Because just 1,000 years after these Natufian brewers, something else happened that changes everything about the alcohol story. The invention of farming. For decades, the theory was that we invented farming to make bread. Man shall not live by bread alone, etc. But a growing number of anthropologists are arguing the opposite. What if we didn't invent farming for food? What if we invented it for beer? This is called the beer before bread hypothesis, championed by scholars like Solomon Katz, and the logic is compelling. Bread is hard to make. It requires grinding, mixing, baking. It's work. And the nutritional payoff, early bread made from wild, unmilled grains, was gritty, hard to chew, and less calorie-dense than just eating the grains raw. Farming for bread doesn't make a lot of sense as a first step. But beer is easy. You take grain, you soak it in water, you leave it alone. The wild yeast does the work, and what you get is a liquid that is calorie-rich, sterile, because the alcohol kills bacteria, and mildly psychoactive. And here's the really important part for our ancestors. Beer is safer to drink than water. We take clean water for granted, but for most of human history, the nearest river or well was also where animals pooped and people dumped garbage. Water gave you dysentery. It gave you cholera. It gave you parasites. But the alcohol in beer, even at a measly 1 or 2%, is enough to kill most of the pathogens in the water. Boiling water does the same thing, but boiling requires a fuel-intensive fire. Beer requires a hole in the ground and a little patience. So, when you see those first Neolithic villages springing up in the Fertile Crescent 12,000 years ago, the first farms, the first domesticated grains, ask yourself, were they growing wheat to make flatbread, or were they growing wheat to make a safe, reliable, slightly joyful drink? The evidence is suggestive. The earliest domesticated grains are a mess. They have brittle rachis, the part that holds the seed that shatters easily, which is terrible for harvesting with a sickle. But it's great for brewing, because you want the grains to come loose easily for soaking. The first farmers didn't select for big, easy-to-grind seeds. They selected for seeds that fell off the plant easily. That's a brewer's trait, not a baker's trait. And look at the tools. The first pottery, around the same time, wasn't for storing grain. The first pots were small, wide-mouthed, and had strainers built into them. They look almost exactly like modern beer brewing pots used to separate the liquid from the grain mash. Archaeologists call them sieve pots, and they appear at the exact same time as the first domesticated cereals. Now, let's move to another part of the world just to see how universal this is. The Natufians and the Fertile Crescent farmers give us beer. But in China, around 9,000 years ago, they were doing something different. At Jiahu, the drink wasn't just grain. It was a cocktail. Rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit. A mead beer-wine hybrid. The pottery vessels used for this drink were also used for burial rituals. Same pattern. Alcohol as a bridge to the afterlife. In South America, around 7,000 years ago, the Andean people started brewing chicha, a corn beer. They would chew the maize, the enzymes in human saliva, break down the starches into fermentable sugars, and spit it into a vat. That's the recipe. It sounds gross to us, but it's genius biochemistry. And they did this not for everyday hydration, but for festivals, for work parties, for religious ceremonies. The Inca would later brew hundreds of thousands of gallons of chicha to pour out on the ground as an offering to the gods. In Africa, the oldest evidence of sorghum beer is a bit later, but the tradition is ancient. The San people of the Kalahari have stories that reference a first beer brewed by the mantis god, and it's made from wild desert fruits and honey. Everywhere you look, the story is the same. Once humans settle down into villages, they start brewing. It's not a luxury. It's a technology. It's a food preservation technique. It's a water purification system. And it's a social lubricant. But we haven't answered the question fully. We know when the genes evolved 10 million years ago. We know when we have archaeological proof of brewing 13,000 years ago, Natufian beer. But there is a gap of about 9.98 million years between the gene and the brewery. What was happening in that gap? Lots. And this is where we have to get creative, because the evidence is not in stones or pots. It's in the behavior of modern hunter-gatherers and in the logic of evolution. Think about the first container. The first thing that could hold a liquid wasn't a clay pot. It was a skin, an animal's stomach, a hollowed-out log, a birch bark basket. These things do not survive in the archaeological record for tens of thousands of years. They rot. So the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is entirely plausible. In fact, it's almost certain that by 40,000 or 50,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were making simple fermented drinks. How? Honey. Honey is the most magical ingredient in the pre-agricultural world. It's pure sugar. It's antiseptic, and it has wild yeast already in it. If you take a cup of honey and mix it with 3 cups of water, and you leave that in a warm place for a few days, you get mead. It's the simplest alcohol in the world. No grain needed, no farming needed. Just a tree hollow full of bees, the courage to steal their honey, and a little patience. Every single hunter-gatherer culture that has access to honey makes mead. It's a universal. The AKA people in Central Africa, the Hadza in Tanzania, the Australian Aboriginals with their sugar bag honey, they all make a version of it. And when did humans start using containers? We have evidence of shell beads and pierced animal teeth from 100,000 years ago. We have bone tools. We have the ability to sew. It takes no giant leap of imagination to say a 50,000-year-old human sitting in a cave had a piece of animal skin, some water, and a honeycomb. They tied the skin into a bag. They mixed. They left it near the fire. They came back 3 days later, and the bag was bloated with gas. They tasted it, and they smiled. That is a plausible first drink. Not grain, not fruit, honey mead, and because it leaves no trace, we will never find it. But the logic of behavior says it existed. So, when did ancient humans start drinking alcohol? The answer is a layering of timelines. 10 million years ago. A genetic mutation in our primate ancestors allowed them to eat fermented fruit on the forest floor, opening a new food niche and selecting for a tolerance to alcohol. At least 100,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, using simple containers made of skins or bark, begin intentionally mixing water and honey to create mead. This is the first recipe, 13,000 years ago. The Natufian people in the Levant brew beer from malted wild grain for funeral rituals. This is the first hard archaeological evidence, 9,000 years ago. Formal brewing traditions emerge independently in China, rice beer, the Caucasus grape wine, and the Andes corn chicha. Now, let me throw one more twist at you, something even older, something that challenges the idea that beer came after bread. In 2018, a team working in the Mediterranean, at a site called Göbekli Tepe. You've heard of Göbekli Tepe, right? It's that massive stone temple complex in Turkey, dated to about 11,500 years ago. It was built by hunter-gatherers, supposedly before farming. The mainstream story was that hunter-gatherers built this temple, and then, to feed the workers, they invented farming. Religion came first, then agriculture, but the researchers at Göbekli Tepe found huge stone vats, massive, carved out of bedrock, each one holding dozens of gallons. And when they analyzed the residues, they found oxalate, beer stone. These vats were brewing vats. The largest structure at the world's oldest temple was a brewery. Now, think about that. The first monumental building in human history wasn't a palace or a granary. It was a place of worship. And attached to that place of worship was an industrial-scale brewery. They weren't just drinking beer, they were drinking it as part of the ritual. The beer was the point. The temple was the cup. This flips the whole narrative. We didn't invent beer because we were bored farmers with too much grain. We invented farming because we needed grain to throw beer festivals for the gods. The desire for alcohol, that ancient primate craving for fermented sugar, might have been the engine that drove the Neolithic Revolution. Not bread, not hunger, thirst. And the social implications of that are enormous. Think about a hunter-gatherer band. A band is small, maybe 25 people. They know each other. They argue. They make peace. There's no real authority. But once you have beer, you can have a feast. And a feast requires labor. Someone has to gather the honey or the grain. Someone has to brew it. Someone has to serve it. And someone gets to be the person who controls the distribution. Alcohol is the first chemical currency. It's the first thing, besides meat, that you can give away that creates a social obligation. I gave you a cup of beer. Now you owe me. That's the seat of hierarchy. That's the seat of patronage. That's the seat of politics. In ancient Mesopotamia, the first written language, cuneiform, wasn't invented to write poetry. It was invented to write down receipts for beer. The earliest surviving written words, from around 5,000 years ago, are symbols for beer and bread. The famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest legal codes, has laws about beer. If a tavern keeper overcharged for beer, she was drowned. That's how seriously they took it. In ancient Egypt, beer was so central to daily life that it was used as a form of payment. The workers who built the pyramids were paid in beer. 4 loaves of bread and 2 jugs of beer a day. That was the wage. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in the world, mention beer as a necessity for the afterlife. The dead need beer. The gods drink beer. The goddess Sekhmet, the one with the lion's head, was sent by Ra to punish humanity, but she got drunk on beer that was dyed red to look like blood, and then she stopped killing everyone. Beer saved the human race, according to the Egyptians. Let's not forget wine. Wine is a different beast. Beer is communal. It's low alcohol. You share a jug. You pass it around. Wine, especially in the ancient world, was stronger. It was reserved for the elite. The earliest evidence of grape wine comes from the Caucasus Mountains in modern-day Georgia, around 8,000 years ago. They found pottery jars with grape seeds and residual wine compounds. The Georgians will tell you they've been making wine for 8,000 years, and they're probably right. But wine required a different kind of labor. You have to plant vineyards. You have to prune. You have to wait years for the first harvest. Wine is an investment. It's the drink of people who have land and time. And wine becomes the drink of the classical world. The Greeks didn't drink beer. They called beer barbarians brew. They drank wine, mixed with water, in symposia, those drinking parties where philosophy was born. Plato's Symposium is literally a conversation about love at a wine-drinking party. And the Romans took wine and spread it across Europe. They planted vines in France, in Spain, in Germany. The Roman Empire was, in a very real way, built on the back of the wine trade. Amphorae, those big clay jars, are the shipping containers of the ancient world, and millions of them were used for wine. The Romans also drank beer, but they saw it as a provincial drink. They had a god of wine, Bacchus. They didn't have a god of beer. They had a goddess of beer, but she was Celtic. She was a local. Now, let's jump to the Americas. No beer made from barley in the pre-Columbian world. No wine from grapes. But they had corn, and they had cacao, and they had agave. The Aztecs and the Maya had a drink called pulque. It's made from the sap of the maguey agave plant. You cut the flower stalk and the plant bleeds a sweet sap called aguamiel, honey water. You collect that sap and it ferments naturally into a thick, viscous, slightly sour beer. The Aztecs considered pulque sacred. It was associated with the god Mayahuel, who had 400 breasts because she was the goddess of the maguey plant, and each breast gave a different type of pulque. Only priests and the elderly could drink it, except during certain festivals, when everyone got blind drunk. But the Aztecs also made a drink that was arguably more important: chocolate. Not the hot chocolate you're thinking of. Real Mesoamerican chocolate was a fermented drink. They took cacao beans, ground them up with water, chili peppers, and sometimes corn, and they let it ferment. It was bitter, frothy, and intoxicating. Cacao was so valuable that the beans were used as money, and the drink was reserved for warriors and nobles. Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, wrote that a cup of this chocolate would make a man drunk without making him lose his senses. So, from the forests of Africa to the highlands of Mexico, from the caves of Israel to the temples of Turkey, one substance unites human civilization: fermented liquid. It is the oldest medicine used as an anesthetic in ancient surgery. It is the oldest entertainment. It is the oldest religious offering. But we have to go back to our original question, because there's one more layer. The deepest layer, the one that might make you rethink what it means to be human. Remember the ADH4 mutation? The one that happened 10 million years ago, which made our ancestors super processors of alcohol? There's another mutation, a later one, and it's just as important. In East Asia, a large percentage of the population has a different mutation. It's a mutation in a different gene, called ALDH2. This one breaks down the next step of alcohol metabolism. People with this mutation lack the ability to fully process alcohol's toxic byproduct, acetaldehyde. The result is the Asian flush, red face, nausea, rapid heartbeat. It's an unpleasant reaction. But here's the thing. This mutation appeared around 10,000 years ago, right when people in southern China were starting to farm rice. And it spread like wildfire. Why? Why would a mutation that makes you sick when you drink alcohol spread so quickly in a population that was just starting to brew rice beer? The theory is fascinating. Acetaldehyde is a nasty chemical. It damages DNA. It causes cancer. But if you have the ALDH2 mutation, you don't get a buildup of acetaldehyde. You get a buildup of something else, and you feel sick, so you stop drinking. You drink less, and therefore your risk of esophageal cancer plummets. In a population that was drinking a lot of home-brewed rice beer, which might have had high levels of contaminants, the mutation that made you hate drinking was actually a survival advantage. It has saved you from getting cancer of the throat. So, we have these two opposing forces in human evolution. The ancient, deep urge to drink the ADH4 mutation, and the newer, local check on that urge, the ALDH2 mutation. We are a species that loves alcohol, but also a species that has evolved in some places to hate it. That tension is still playing out today, in every conversation about just one more drink. Now, let's talk about the really deep past again. Neanderthals, our heavy-browed cousins. Did they drink? We don't have direct evidence, but we have clues. Neanderthals had the ADH4 gene. They had the same mutation we did. They ate a lot of meat, but they also gathered plants, including some wild grains. And here's a fascinating discovery. At a Neanderthal site in Iraq called Shanidar Cave, there's pollen evidence that they buried their dead with flowers. They had ritual behavior, and where you have ritual, you often have alcohol. It's a pattern across all human cultures. The sacred and the intoxicated go together. There's no smoking gun, no Neanderthal beer stone. But if you asked me to bet, I'd say yes. Neanderthals 50,000 years ago found a hollow log full of fermented honey water. They drank it. They liked it. And they figured out how to make it happen again. They weren't stupid. They had brains as big as ours. They made glue from birch bark. They hunted cave bears. They could absolutely mix water and honey in a skin bag and wait. So, the timeline, again, but now, including our cousins. 10 million years ago, common ancestor of humans, chimps, and gorillas gets the ADH4 mutation. The ability to process alcohol becomes a survival trait for scavenging fermented fruit. 800,000 years ago, Homo heidelbergensis, the ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans, controls fire. With fire comes boiled water, but also the ability to heat honey and grain mixtures, potentially speeding up fermentation. We have no proof, but the tools are there. 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens independently discover mead and simple fruit wines. This is the dark age of alcohol archaeology, because the containers were organic and have rotted away. 40,000 years ago, the Aurignacian culture in Europe makes sophisticated bone tools and sewn clothing. They are absolutely capable of making a leather brewing bag. No evidence, but the capability is undeniable. 13,000 years ago, the Natufians in the Levant brew malted barley beer for funeral feasts. Hard evidence. 11,500 years ago. The people at Göbekli Tepe brew industrial quantities of beer for temple rituals. 9,000 years ago, independent invention of rice beer in China Jiahu, grape wine in Georgia, and chicha in the Andes. Now, I want to end on a personal note, or rather a human note. We've been talking about genes and pots and residues, but the question, when did ancient humans start drinking alcohol, is really asking something else. It's asking, when did we start wanting to change our state of mind on purpose? Because that's what drinking is. It's a deliberate, voluntary alteration of consciousness. And that urge, the urge to not be exactly as you are right now for a little while, is profoundly human. We don't see that in other animals. Chimps will eat fermented fruit if it's there, but they don't save it for later. They don't share it ritually. They don't tell stories about the god of the fig. But we do. From the earliest cave paintings to the latest cocktail bar, we have been using plants and chemistry to open doors in our own minds. Alcohol is the oldest key. We started drinking because we were hungry. The alcohol helped us access calories in rotten fruit. Then we started drinking because we were thirsty. The alcohol helped us kill the germs in dirty water. Then we started drinking because we were lonely. The alcohol helped us bond with strangers. Then we started drinking because we were afraid. The alcohol helped us talk to the gods and calm the fear of death. Every reason we have for drinking today, celebration, sorrow, boredom, ritual, courage, escape, has an echo that goes back 10 million years. When you raise a glass, you're not just toasting the person across from you. You're toasting every single one of your ancestors, from the little monkey in the Miocene forest to the Natufian mourner at the cave tomb, who all looked at a bubbling puddle and said, "Yes, this is good." So, when did ancient humans start drinking alcohol? There's no one date. It's not a moment you can circle on a calendar. It's a gradient. It's a slow, deep, evolutionary and cultural shift that began before we were human, continued through every stage of our becoming, and will probably continue as long as there are humans. The best answer is probably this. We started drinking as soon as we could, and that was a very, very long time ago. Let me leave you with one final image. It's not from a dig site or a lab report. It's from a story. The Sumerians, 4,000 years ago, had a poem. It's called the Hymn to Ninkasi. Ninkasi was the Sumerian goddess of beer. The poem is actually a recipe. It describes how to brew beer in a house of the gods, and it ends with a line that, translated, goes something like, "You are the one who soaks the malt in a jar. The waves rise, the waves fall. You are the one who bakes the bapper, the beer bread, in the great oven. You are the one who puts the beer in the collecting vat. It is like the Tigris and the Euphrates, flowing." 4,000 years ago, a poet compared a vat of beer to two great rivers. That's how important it was. That's how ancient the feeling is. The beer flowed, and so did civilization. So, the next time you take a sip, think about that. You are not just drinking. You are participating in the oldest human technology, the one that kept us alive, the one that brought us together, the one that made us human. So, we ended with the Sumerian hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, and we left a toast hanging in the air. That feels right, because a toast is never really the end. It's a pause, a moment of recognition before you take another sip. And that's what this is, a pause in the story to take a longer, deeper look at what happened after those first accidental brews. Because here's the thing about the timeline we just walked through. It's linear. It's neat. It goes from a monkey eating a fermented fig to a Sumerian priestess reciting a beer recipe. But real history is never that tidy. Alcohol didn't just appear in one place and spread. It erupted everywhere, independently, like mushrooms after rain, and each culture took that basic chemical process, yeast plus sugar equals alcohol plus pleasure, and twisted it into something that matched their land, their gods, and their stomachs. So let's do something a little different in this second part. Let's not just go forward in time, let's go sideways. Let's look at the great alcohol traditions of the ancient world as if we were a traveler, a drunk, curious time traveler, hopping from one civilization to another, tasting everything, asking the same question. Why this? Why here? Why now? Our first stop, since we just mentioned Sumer, is Mesopotamia. But not just the cities, the marshes. The Sumerians lived between the Tigris and Euphrates, but their beer wasn't made from barley grown in neat fields. Early on it was made from emmer wheat and wild barley, gathered from the edges of the great marshes. And they didn't have bottles. They didn't have cans. They had sila jars, clay vessels with a spout at the bottom. You would pour water into the top over a mash of grain and let it trickle down through a filter of straw and reeds. The beer that came out the spout was cloudy, thick with husks and probably a little sour. You didn't sip it. You sucked it through a long reed straw, which had a little clay strainer at the end to keep the chunks out. That image, people sitting in a circle, passing a large jar, each with a long straw, is the oldest known depiction of social drinking. It's on a cylinder seal from Uruk, dating to about 3,500 BC, before the pyramids, before Stonehenge, just people, straws, and a big pot of beer. And here's the detail that kills me. The straws were often decorated with little animals or gods. You had your personal drinking straw, the way a Victorian gentleman had his own pipe. That straw was an extension of your identity. It said, "I am the one who drinks from the east side of the jar," or "I am the priest who gets the first draw." Because the beer was a social leveler, everyone drank from the same container. But the straws introduced hierarchy. The longest straw? That might be for the king. The straw with the golden calf on it? That's the temple treasurer. The plain reed? That's the farmer who grew the barley. So already, in the very first beer culture, you see the double nature of alcohol. It brings people together, but it also marks their rank. A toast can be a prayer of equals, or it can be a command. Now, let's jump to Egypt. Not the pyramid building era, we covered that a bit, but the New Kingdom, around 1200 BC. This is the time of Ramses the Great, of chariots and golden death masks, and beer is still the drink of the people. But something has changed. The Egyptians have started to really understand the craft of fermentation. They've discovered that if you bake a special loaf of bread, a dense, undercooked, sugary bread, and then crumble it into water, you get a much stronger, cleaner beer. They called this bread Beisha, and the beer was Henket. But here's the twist. The Egyptians also had wine. They had vineyards in the Nile Delta, and they imported wine from Canaan, from Lebanon, from Syria. Wine was expensive. Wine was for the dead, painted on tomb walls as an offering to Osiris. Wine was for the living too, but only the rich. A nobleman's wine cellar was a status symbol. A peasant's beer jug was a necessity. And the Egyptians did something that no one else did. They wrote down hangover cures. We have a papyrus from Thebes, the Chester Beatty Medical Papyrus, which includes a remedy for a head that is hot and heavy from drinking too much wine. The cure? Chew up some juniper berries, mix them with a paste of frankincense and myrrh, and swallow it with a glass of beer. Yes, beer to cure a hangover from wine. That's either brilliant or a terrible idea. I'll let you decide. But let's not stay in the Near East forever. Let's go to a place that rarely gets mentioned in the history of alcohol, the steppes of Central Asia. Because this is where something truly revolutionary happens. Not beer, not wine, the big one. The one that changes everything, distillation. Now, you might think distillation was invented by alchemists in the Middle Ages, and you'd be partly right. But the first crude distillation of alcohol, the process of heating a fermented liquid and capturing the vapor, which condenses into something much stronger, happened thousands of years earlier, probably somewhere around the border of modern Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, in a region called Bactria. The evidence is thin, because stills are metal, and metal gets melted down and reused. But we have indirect clues. The appearance of very strong, very pure alcohol in medical texts from the ancient Indus Valley civilization. The Ayurvedic text Charaka Samhita, written around 300 BC, but based on much older traditions, describes a cleansed wine that is sharp, dry, and quick to cause intoxication. That sounds like distilled spirit. It sounds like something in the 40% alcohol range, not the 10% of wine. Why would anyone distill alcohol? The answer is not to get drunk faster, though that's a nice side effect. The answer is medicine. Distilled alcohol, what the Islamic world would later call arak sweat or alcohol, the finely ground powder from which we get alcohol, was the first true antiseptic. Before germ theory, before hand washing, alcohol was used to clean wounds, to preserve herbs, to extract the active compounds from plants. A 20% beer will not disinfect a cut. A 70% spirit will. The invention of distillation turned alcohol from a food and a social lubricant into a pharmaceutical. And who were the first great distillers? The evidence points to the Scythians, those nomadic horsemen who ruled the steppes from the Black Sea to Mongolia. The Greeks wrote about them. Herodotus, the father of history, said the Scythians had a habit of throwing hemp seeds onto hot stones in a covered tent and inhaling the vapor. That's not distillation, that's vaporization. But it shows they understood that heat could release the essence of a plant. It's a small step from that to boiling a wine or beer and capturing the steam. The Scythians didn't have glass or copper distillation apparatus, but they had leather tents, clay pots, and a lot of time on horseback. It's plausible that they discovered that if you put a fermented mare's milk kumis into a skin bag and leave it in the sun, the water evaporates and the alcohol concentration goes up. That's freeze distillation, actually, the opposite of heat distillation. But freeze distillation works too. If you leave a barrel of beer outside in a Siberian winter, the water freezes and the alcohol stays liquid. You can pour off the remaining liquid and it's much stronger. That's how they made Archaeology in Mongolia. So, distillation might be as old as 2,500 years, maybe older. But the first clear archaeological evidence comes from the Islamic Golden Age, around 800 AD, when Persian chemists like Al-Razi and Al-Kindi wrote detailed instructions for constructing al-Ambik, the alembic. That's the still we recognize today, the pot, the dome, the spout, the cooling coil. With an alembic, you can turn mediocre wine into strong brandy. You can turn barley beer into whiskey's great-grandfather. But that's relatively late. For most of ancient history, alcohol was low-proof, 4%, 5%, maybe 12% for a good wine. That meant you could drink all day without losing your mind. In fact, in many ancient cultures, you did drink all day because the water was dangerous. The Roman legions marched on sour wine mixed with water, posca. The Greek slaves drank a thin, vinegary wine called oxys. The Chinese peasants drank ju, a millet beer that was barely above 1%. This is a crucial point that modern alcohol discussions often miss. Ancient people weren't trying to get blackout drunk, at least not most of the time. They were trying to stay alive. And alcohol, even at low concentrations, killed the bacteria in their water. It was a survival technology that happened to make you feel pleasant. Of course, they also knew how to get roaring drunk. The Greeks had the komos, a drunken procession through the streets, which is where we get the word comedy. The Romans had the bacchanalia, which got so out of hand that the Senate banned them in 186 BC. The Chinese had the YI drinkers, who would compete to see who could drink the most Jew without passing out. Getting drunk was a sport, a ritual, and a sin, all at the same time. But let's go to a culture that took drinking to its most philosophical extreme, ancient India. The Vedas, the oldest Hindu scriptures, are full of references to soma. Soma was a ritual drink pressed from a plant, mixed with milk or honey, and then drunk by priests. The drinker would feel the gods enter his body. He would see visions. He would become immortal for a few hours. The Rig Veda has an entire book of hymns dedicated to soma. We have drunk soma. We have become immortal. We have gone to the light. We have found the gods. What was soma? Nobody knows for sure. The plant was described as growing on the mountains, with juice that is brown, yellow, and red. Some say it was ephedra, which contains ephedrine. Some say it was a hallucinogenic mushroom, maybe Amanita muscaria. Some say it was just fermented barley or hemp. The mystery is part of the power. But here's the key. Soma was not casual. It was not a party drink. It was a sacrament. The entire ritual, the pressing, the filtering, the chanting, the drinking, was designed to produce a specific altered state that was interpreted as divine contact. And that's the thread that runs through every ancient alcohol culture. From the Natufians in their cave, to the Aztecs with their pulque, to the Vedic priests with their soma. Alcohol was not separate from religion. It was religion, the first chemical that opened the door to the supernatural. Now, let's go to a place where alcohol was seen in a completely different light. Ancient Israel. The Hebrew Bible has a very complicated relationship with wine. On one hand, wine is a blessing. Wine that gladdens the heart of man, says Psalm 104. Wine is poured out as a libation to God. The Passover meal requires 4 cups of wine. On the other hand, prophets denounce those who are heroes at drinking wine. Noah gets drunk and lies naked in his tent. Lot gets drunk and his daughters. Well, the story is not a good one. The Jewish solution to this tension was ritualization. You don't just drink wine. You say a blessing over it. You sanctify the Sabbath with a cup of wine, kiddush. You mark the end of the Sabbath with a cup of wine, havdalah. By wrapping the alcohol in ceremony, you tame its wildness. You remind yourself that the drink is a gift from God, not an excuse to act like an animal. This idea that alcohol is good but dangerous, that it must be controlled by ritual and law, spread from Judaism into Christianity and Islam. Islam famously banned all alcohol in the Quran, but it took time. The early Muslims in Mecca drank wine. There are verses in the Quran that say drinking contains sin and benefit. but the sin is greater than the benefit. Later, verses are stricter. Avoid it. And finally, it is an abomination from Satan. The ban was phased in over years because the community was not ready to give up its wine. But here's the irony. Even with the ban, the Islamic world became the center of alcohol science. Persian and Arab physicians distilled alcohol, studied its effects, and used it to make perfumes and medicines. The word alcohol comes from Arabic. The alembic is an Arabic invention. The first clear description of whiskey, aquaviti, comes from a Persian alchemist, Abu Bakr al-Razi. So the culture that rejected drinking for its believers was the culture that perfected the art of making strong spirits for the rest of the world. Now, let's jump to a different hemisphere entirely. The Americas before Columbus. No beer, no wine, but a dazzling array of fermented drinks that most people have never heard of. We mentioned pulque and chicha, but there's also casiri, made from sweet potatoes and cassava by the indigenous peoples of the Amazon. They would chew the cassava, spit it into a pot, and let human saliva enzymes convert the starches to sugar, which then fermented. The result was a thick, sour beer that was drunk at every important occasion: births, deaths, marriages, harvests. And then there's tepache, made from pineapple rinds and brown sugar, still popular in Mexico today, and balche, a Mayan drink made from the bark of the balsha tree, mixed with honey and fermented. The Mayans believed balcha was an intoxicant given to them by the god of the forest. You could only drink it during rituals, and you had to drink it from a gourd. If you spilled any, you were supposed to apologize to the earth. What's striking about all these American drinks is that they almost always involve spitting. Chewing a root or a grain to convert starches to sugars is called mastic fermentation. And it's one of the oldest biotechnologies in the world. It's the same process used in East Asia to make sake and xiangju, except in East Asia they use a mold called koji instead of saliva. The idea is the same. Break down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars that yeast can eat. So, the technology of brewing is universal, but the methods are endlessly local. That's what makes alcohol history so rich. It's not one story. It's 10,000 stories, each one adapted to a specific climate, a specific crop, a specific god. Now, I want to talk about something we've only hinted at: alcohol and power. Because if alcohol is a social lubricant, it's also a political weapon. Every empire that has ever existed has tried to control the production and distribution of alcohol, because the person who controls the drink controls the conversation. Take ancient Rome. The Romans planted vineyards everywhere they conquered: Gaul, Hispania, Germania, Britannia. Why? Because they loved wine, yes, but also because turning conquered peoples into wine drinkers made them more Roman. The locals would adopt Roman customs, Roman gods, Roman drinking vessels. They would trade their grain for Roman wine. They would become economically dependent. The wine trade was a tool of soft imperialism. Or take the Han Dynasty in China. The emperors tried to ban private brewing several times, establishing state monopolies on jus. The official reason was to prevent grain waste during famines, but the real reason was control. If the state controls the alcohol, the state controls the taverns. And if the state controls the taverns, the state controls where people gather and what they talk about. Sound familiar? The same logic was used by the British in colonial India, by the Americans during Prohibition, by the Russians under every Tsar and General Secretary. Alcohol is not just a drink, it is a resource, and resources are contested. But let's go back to the ancient world for one more stop. The Vikings. Because the Vikings had a drinking culture that was so intense, so ritualized, and so central to their identity that it shaped their entire worldview. The Viking drink of choice was ale, made from barley, but they also made mead honey wine, which was considered the drink of poets and kings. The Norse creation myth says that the world was made from the body of the giant Ymir, but the mead of poetry, a magical mead that gave anyone who drank it the ability to compose verse, was made from the blood of a wise man named Kvasir. Odin, the chief god, tricked a giant into giving him the mead by turning into a snake, crawling into the giant's mountain, and seducing his daughter. Then he turned into an eagle, flew back to Asgard, and spat the mead into a pot. That's the kind of story you tell when mead is really, really important to you. For the Vikings, drinking was not separate from fighting, from law, or from friendship. A feast was called a sumbel, or symbol. At the sumbel, everyone sat in a specific order based on rank. They passed a horn of ale from person to person. The horn was often decorated with silver and runes. As you took the horn, you made a promise, a boast, a vow. I will avenge my father. I will marry the chieftain's daughter. I will not rest until I have killed the man who burned my hall. And once you made that promise over a horn of ale, it was binding. You could not take it back. The drink was the witness. The gods were listening. This is a profound use of alcohol, not to escape reality, but to create reality, to make words into deeds, to turn a thought into an oath. The Viking sumbel is the ancestor of every cheers, and to your health. And let's raise a glass to... It's the recognition that alcohol dissolves the boundary between intention and action. When you drink, you mean what you say, or at least you're held accountable as if you meant it. Now, let's bring this all back to the original question. When did ancient humans start drinking alcohol? We've answered it genetically, archaeologically, and culturally. But there's one more answer. And it's the most uncomfortable one. It's the answer about the dark side. Because alcohol has always had a shadow. For as long as we have drunk, we have also abused. The ancient Egyptians wrote about hangovers. The Greeks wrote about methy, drunken rage. The Romans had a word, ebrietas, which meant habitual, shameful drunkenness. The Chinese had official punishments for public intoxication as early as the Zhou dynasty, 1000 BC. The Aztecs executed nobles who got drunk in public because it was considered a disgrace to the gods. So the question is not just when we started drinking, but when we started over-drinking. And the answer is immediately. As soon as there was enough alcohol in one place for one person to drink too much, someone did. And they did it on purpose. Why? Because the same mechanism that makes alcohol a social bond, the lowering of inhibitions, the release of endorphins, the feeling of warmth and connection, can also become a cage. For some people, one drink is never enough. The ancient world had no concept of addiction as a disease. They saw the drunkard as weak-willed, possessed by a demon, or just stupid. But they saw him. They wrote about him. He was always there, at the edge of the feast, the one who wouldn't let go of the cup. There's a Sumerian proverb written on a clay tablet around 2000 BC that goes like this: "He who drinks too much beer, his heart is not his own. He forgets his mother and his father. He falls in a ditch and is bitten by a scorpion. That's a hangover and a half." So the history of alcohol is not a triumphal march from the forest floor to the cocktail lounge. It's a wobble, a stumble, a long, unsteady walk that sometimes ends in a celebration and sometimes ends in a ditch. But we kept walking, because the pleasure, the safety, the community, and the transcendence, for most people most of the time, outweighed the risk. Now, I want to end this second part with a story, a true story from archaeology, but one that feels like a myth. In 2016, a team of researchers was excavating a site in western Armenia, in a cave called Areni 1. The same cave where they found the world's oldest known leather shoe, 5,500 years old. They were digging down, past the shoe, past the copper tools, past the pottery, until they reached a layer dated to about 6,100 years ago. And there, in a shallow pit, lined with stones, they found something extraordinary. A vat, a clay vat about 2 feet wide, cracked and broken, but still standing. Around the vat were grape seeds, not just a few, hundreds of them, thousands of them. And the seeds were not random, they were pressed. They were the remains of crushed grapes. In the bottom of the vat, the residue left behind, a reddish-brown crust, was chemically analyzed. It contained malvidine, a compound found only in grape skins, and tartaric acid, the signature acid of wine, and no evidence of any other fruit. They had found a wine press and a wine vat from 6,100 years ago. But that's not the story. The story is what was next to the vat, a pile of dried-up ancient grapevines. The earliest domesticated grapevine remains ever found. Someone, over 6,000 years ago, had planted a vineyard, harvested the grapes, crushed them with their feet, and left the juice to ferment in a clay vat inside a cave. Then they walked away. The cave was sealed. The vat sat for 61 centuries, and when the archaeologists opened it, they could still smell it. Faintly, a ghost of wine, a whiff of fermentation from a drink that had been made when the pyramids were still a daydream and the Romans were just a cluster of huts on 7 hills. That smell is the closest thing we have to time travel. It is a direct chemical message from a person who did exactly what we do today. They took something sweet, they left it alone, and they waited. They waited because they knew what would happen. They knew because their parents knew, and their grandparents knew, back through a chain of knowledge that leads directly to that monkey in the Miocene forest, smelling a fig and feeling a strange, pleasant dizziness for the first time. So, when did ancient humans start drinking alcohol? They started as soon as the universe gave them sugar and yeast. They started because they were curious. They started because they were thirsty. They started because they were already reaching for something beyond the moment, and alcohol was the first easy handhold. And they never stopped